The hiring fare at Norbury Cross had thinned to its dregs by the time he came, and the 12 coins lay cold in the parish agent's palm before she understood that the man in the navy coat had bought the whole of her year. She had stood since dawn against the churchyard wall with the other unhired women, a card pinned to her shawl that read, "Laundress, plain cook, no character offered." The phrase "no character offered" meant only that no former master would vouch for her, because the woman she had served had died in a fever house, with the rent owing, but the farmers reading the card heard it the way they were meant to hear it. They moved on. The rain had begun by noon, a thin gray English rain that found the worn places in her cloak and settled there, and she had stopped feeling the cold in her feet some while before the carriage stopped at the gate. He did not haggle. That was the thing she would remember first, afterward, when she tried to find the beginning of it. The other gentleman who came to a hiring fare haggled as a matter of course, drove the parish agent down a shilling, weighed a woman the way they weighed a heifer. This one looked at the card, looked once at her face, and named the full sum the agent asked, without a breath of objection. 12 coins. A year of her labor, bound by the parish indenture, transferred from one cold hand to another, while she stood close enough to hear the leather of his glove creak. She had learned long ago to keep her face still. She kept it still. Now. She did not curtsy more deeply than the station on her card required, and she did not lower her eyes the full measure that a grateful pauper was expected to lower them, and a flicker of something crossed the gentleman's gray eyes. When she failed to, he marked it. She saw that he marked it, and she did not look away, and that was her first mistake, because a laundress with no character did not hold a marquess's gaze across a churchyard as though they stood on level ground. His name was the Marquess of Wexcombe, though she did not learn it until the steward said it in the carriage, and his estate lay 9 miles north along the river road. He said almost nothing on the drive. He sat across from her with his hands folded on the head of a walking stick and his face turned to the window, and the rain ran down the glass between them, and once, only once, he asked whether she was warm enough, in a voice so level she could not tell whether it was kindness or merely the question a man asks of a horse he has just paid too much for. She was not warm enough. She said that she was. What the Marquess did not know, what no one in that wet churchyard knew, was that the woman he had bought for 12 coins had once been carried into a cathedral under a canopy of cloth of gold, and that the men who had killed her father had set a price on her head far greater than 12 coins, and that she had crossed half of Europe in the boots of a dead drummer boy, to keep her own throat from the knife. He thought he had bought a laundress. He had bought the last living daughter of a murdered prince. Stay with this woman a while. She is about to be told to disappear, and she is going to refuse, very quietly, in a house that does not yet know what it is holding. Her name, the name on the parish roll, was Rosamund Hale, and Hale was a borrowed name, a plain English name she had taken from a milestone on the Dover Road, because it was short and unremarkable and no one would ever ask her to spell it. She had chosen it the way a hunted creature chooses cover, for its plainness, and she had worn it for 3 years until it had begun to feel almost like her own. The other name, the one written in a register that had burned, she did not let herself think on. To think on it was to feel the floor of the cathedral under her slippers again, and to feel that was to be a girl of 9 watching her father lifted onto the shoulders of strangers, and she could not afford to be that girl any longer. That girl was dead. Rosamund Hale was alive, and Rosamund Hale needed the position, and the position was at Wexcombe Park. The house, when they came to it through the failing light, was older and graver than she had expected. Gray stone gone darker with rain, a long low front of mullioned windows, and a single lamp burning in a ground-floor room, where the curtains had not been drawn. She was taken in at the servant's door, given a tallow candle and a truss of bedding, and a room under the eaves she was to share with a kitchen girl named Bess, and she was told by the housekeeper, a thin, upright woman named Mrs. Hare, Argent, that the Marquess kept early hours and a quiet house, and did not wish his servants seen above stairs without cause. She understood the instruction. She had been a servant long enough to understand that the chief duty of a servant was to not exist until summoned. That first week she did not exist. She scrubbed and rinsed and wrung and carried, and her hands cracked at the knuckles in the cold lye water, and she ate her bread at the long deal table with the others, and learned the shape of the household by listening. She learned that the Marquess had been widowed young, that his wife had died of a low fever in the second year of their marriage, and that he had not danced, nor dined out, nor opened the great room since, that the county had decided he was proud, and the village had decided he was grieving, and that both were a little afraid of him. She learned that his late wife's mother still lived in the dower house across the park, the Dowager Lady Estcourt, and that the Dowager came up to the house when she pleased and ruled it through Mrs. Stemps. Argent as though her daughter had never died and she herself had never been required to give up her keys. She learned on the fourth day that the Marquess had noticed her. It was a small thing. She had been sent to the library to carry out the ash, before dawn, when she had been assured the room would be empty. And it was not empty. He was sitting in the dark by the cold grate with a book he was not reading, and when she stopped on the threshold with her bucket and her brush, he did not start, did not order her out, only looked at her across the room the way he had looked at her in the churchyard, steady and grey and unhurried. She should have curtsied and withdrawn. She knew the rule. The book in his hands, though, was a French edition. She had seen the title stamped on the spine as the candlelight caught it, and the words had risen in her of their own accord before her caution could stop them. And she had told him, in the plain flat English of a laundress, that the binder had set two of the gatherings out of order, that pages 40 and 41 came after 44, that she had noticed it from the doorway, by the running heads. A laundress cannot read French. A laundress cannot read the running heads of a book across a dark room. The silence, after she said, it was the longest of her life. He closed the book. He turned it in his hands and found the fault exactly where she had named it. The two gatherings bound out of true, and he looked up at her, and the gray eyes had changed, had sharpened to something that was not suspicion, and was not yet anything she could name. He asked her where she had learned her letters. She said her mother had taught her. It was not a lie. He asked whether her mother had taught her French. She said that her mother had taught her many things, and she curtsied, and she carried out the ash, and her heart was beating so hard in her throat that she was certain he could hear it across the room. To the household, she was the new laundress with the cracked hands and the closed face. The woman of no character bought cheap at Norbury Cross. To Mrs. Argent, she was a pair of hands that wrung a sheet too slowly. To Bess she was a quiet bedfellow who lay awake too long. None of them saw what the Marquess had begun to see, and what he saw he kept behind a face still as ice, over a river. And he said nothing, and he watched. The Dowager came up to the house on the seventh day, and the Dowager saw at once. Lady Estcourt was a handsome, upright woman of 60, with her dead daughter's coloring and a voice trained across 40 years to remain gracious while it wounded. She came into the kitchen passage as Rosamond knelt at the hearthstone with a brush, and she stopped, and she looked down the length of her at the kneeling woman, and she said to Mrs. Call, "Argent," not to Rosamond, that the new creature held herself oddly for a scullery hand, that there was something in the neck and the wrists that did not match the card she was bought on, and that a wise housekeeper looked twice at a servant who carried herself as though she were doing the house a favor by scrubbing its floors. She said it pleasantly. She said it the way a woman strokes a dog. She is deciding whether to have drowned. Tea-a-day. Rosamond kept her eyes on the hearthstone and her face on the brush, and she did not stand, and she felt the Dowager's attention pass over her like the shadow of a hawk over a field, and she knew, with the old, cold certainty that had kept her alive through 3 boarders and 2 false names, that this woman would be the one who came for her. Not the Marquess with his gray eyes and his French book. This one, the one who had recognized before anyone else in the county that the card on her shawl was a lie. That was the first of 3 times the Dowager would name her aloud as something less than she was, and Rosamond counted it, the way she counted everything, quietly, against a reckoning she did not yet know how to claim. The autumn deepened. The work did not lighten, but the Marquess began in ways no one but Rosamond could have traced, to alter the shape of her days. A standing order came down through Mrs. Argent, that the library ash was henceforth to be carried by the new woman and no other, before dawn alone. A second order followed, that the laundress was to mend the books in the Marquess's small study, the ones with broken hinges and loosened plates, since she had shown she knew their make. No one questioned it. Mending books was lowly work, fit for a laundress's raw and chapped fingers. Only Rosamond understood that the orders were a door, held open a finger's width, and that the man holding it open never once let his face confess that his hand was on the latch. He would come to the study while she worked. He would sit with his ledgers at the far table and not speak, and the silence between them would fill slowly with the small sounds of paper and paste and the fire, and once an hour, perhaps, he would ask her a question he already half knew the answer to. He asked her what the Latin under a coat of arms meant, and listened to her translate it without surprise. He asked whether she had ever seen the sea, and she said she had crossed it, and he did not ask which sea or why, but his pen stopped on the page for the length of a breath before it moved on. He asked her nothing she could not answer truthfully and sideways, and she answered him truthfully and sideways, and a thing grew between them in that study that neither of them named, a thing made entirely of the things they did not say. It frightened her more than the dowager did. The dowager she understood. The Marquess sitting quiet at his ledgers while the firelight moved on his hard, still face, asking her only the questions she could bear, leaving the rest in the silence like a gift he would not insult her by naming, undid the careful distance she had kept around herself for 3 years. She caught herself listening for his step in the passage. Land. She caught herself, one gray afternoon, holding a mended book to her chest after he had gone, and breathing in the leather and the cold and the faint smell of the rain on his coat, and she set the book down as though it had burned her, because a laundress who let herself love a Marquess was a laundress who had decided to break her own heart for sport. What she did not know, what she could not have known, was that he had already begun to make inquiries. Not openly. The Marquess did nothing openly. Yet a man does not sit across a study from a laundress who reads 3 languages and translates heraldic Latin and crosses seas. She will not name and feel his own grief stir for the first time in 4 years, without beginning, very quietly, to ask the world what manner of woman he has bought for 12 coins. He had sent a letter to a man he trusted in town. He was waiting on the answer. And the dowager who watched the Marquess the way Rosamond watched the dowager had seen the letter go. What the dowager saw was the engine of everything that followed. She saw her widowed son by marriage, the man whose title and estate and her own continued place in the world all depended upon his never marrying beneath him, begin to look at a bought servant the way a man looks at a woman he means to keep. She had spent 4 years guarding the empty place her daughter had left, and she did not intend to surrender it to a creature off a hiring card. She was not cruel for cruelty's sake. She was a woman whose whole life had been built inside an order, and the order was being threatened, and she moved to defend it the way such women always move, with patience, with money, and with the truth bent just far enough to serve. She began with the parish indenture. She sent her own man to Norbury Cross and bought up the paper that bound Rosamond to a year's service, bought the debt outright from the agent, so that the laundress was now indentured not to the Marquess, but to the dowager across the park. It was done within the law. It was done so quietly that Rosamond learned of it only when Mrs. Happer, Argent, white about the mouth, told her that her papers had been called in, and that she was to present herself at the Dower House at 3 o'clock. The Dower House was cold in a way. The Great House was not, kept cold on purpose. A house of polished surfaces and shut shutters. The dowager received her standing, and she did not offer her a chair, and she held the indenture in her 2 hands, as though weighing whether to fold it or to tear it. She told Rosamond in her gracious, wounding voice that she knew what she was. She said it 3 different ways, circling. She said that a clever adventuress could read a French book and ape a lady's neck and turn a lonely man's head, and that she had seen the trick worked before, and that she would not see it worked on a house she had given her daughter to. She said that the laundress would take £50 and a clean character, written in the dowager's own hand, and would be gone from the county by the week's end on the morning coach, and would never write to the Marquess, nor speak his name. £50 was a great deal of money to a woman with chapped and bleeding knuckles. It was 4 years of wages. It was passage to anywhere. This was the second time the dowager named her, aloud as less than she was, and this time there was no hearthstone to keep her eyes on, only the older woman's face, and Rosamond lifted her own face and looked at it. She did not take the £50. She did not weep, nor protest, nor plead her innocence. She said, in the plain flat English she had built her safety on, that she was bound to serve out her year, and that she would serve it, and that the place a year's service was owed had been changed by the dowager's own hand to the dower house, and that she would scrub the dower house floors as faithfully as she had scrubbed the others, and that she begged her ladyship's pardon, but she had given her word to the parish, and her word was not for sale at £50, nor at 500. And the dowager, who had broken cleverer women than this with less, looked at the kneeling laundress who would not kneel, and felt the first cold finger of doubt, because adventuresses took the money. Only one kind of woman refused it, and that kind of woman the dowager had been raised among. And she knew the bearing of it in her bones, and the knowing frightened her into doing the thing that undid her. She set Rosamond to the hardest, lowest, most punishing labor the dower house could devise, and she set it in full view of the Marquess. She had the laundress brought across the park each morning to beat the carpets in the forecourt, where the road from the great house ran, where the Marquess could not ride out without passing her at her work. She meant it as a lesson and a warning, to him and to the creature both. She meant him to see his laundress reduced to a beast of burden in the open, the cracked hands, the bent back, the borrowed mantle thin against the November wind, and to feel the gulf of station yawn between them, and to come to his senses. She had calculated everything except what such a sight would do to a man who had buried one woman in silence, and had sworn in that silence never again to fail to speak. He passed her on the third morning. Well, she did not look up from the carpet. He reined in his horse at the edge of the forecourt, and he sat his horse and watched her work in the cold, and the dowager watched from the dower house window, and the whole still tableau hung there for the length of a held breath. Then he dismounted. He crossed the gravel to where she stood with the beater in her raw hands, and he took off his own riding gloves, the good leather gloves, and he held them out to her, and he said in his level voice that she was to put them on. It was a command. It was the kind of command he gave, the kind the household read as coldness, and that Rosamond alone read truly. Come inside, sit down, eat something. Put on the gloves. She did not put on the gloves. She could not. In front of the dower house window, with the indenture in the dowager's hands, she told him, low, that her ladyship would see, and he said, looking not at her but up at the window where the dowager stood, in a voice pitched to carry the width of the forecourt, that her ladyship had seen a great deal that morning, and that he would have words with her ladyship within the hour, and that until those words were had, the laundress would beat no more carpets in his sight. The dowager understood, watching from her cold window, that she had overplayed her hand. She withdrew Rosamond from the forecourt that same day. She did not retreat, though. She did the thing that confidently wrong people do when the open move has failed. She went looking for proof that the creature was a fraud, and because the creature was not what the dowager believed her to be, the proof the dowager went looking for did not exist, and so the dowager set about, very carefully. The autumn turned hard then, and there is no softening what came next. The answer to the Marquess's letter had come to town, and was on its way north. An answer from the trusted man who had quietly traced a laundress who read 3 languages back along the road she had come, through a forged name and a dead drummer boy's boots, to a burned register and a sacked principality across the water, and to a price still standing on the head of a prince's daughter. The man had written it all in a sealed packet, and had sent it by a rider. And the dowager, who had a servant in the great house in her pay, learned that the packet was coming, and understood that whatever it held it could only be the Marquess's case for the woman, and not against her, and she resolved that the packet would never reach his hands. It did not. The dowager's man took the rider's packet on the river road in the dark, and what he could not read he could destroy, and the sealed account of who Rosamond truly was went into the dower house fire while she slept under the eaves 9 miles of grief away. In its place the dowager prepared another letter, in another hand an old trick and a vile one, a letter purporting to come from a former master in a far county, attesting that the woman calling herself Rosamond Hale was a known thief who had robbed a sick room and fled, and she meant to lay it before the Marquess as the fruit of her own loyal inquiry. The very week the true packet would have arrived, so that the lie should fall into the place the truth had been meant to fill. And then the worst of it. The dowager, to make the forged charge stick before the Marquess could doubt it, had a few small valuable things removed from the great house, and a single one of them, a chased silver thimble case that had been the late Marchioness's, slipped among Rosamond's few belongings in the room under the eaves, where a search she would herself demand would be certain to find it. It was found. Of course it was found. Mrs. Argent, weeping, turned it out of the bedding before the steward and the dowager's man and 2 footmen, and the forged letter was produced in the same hour, and the case against the laundress was made complete and public in the space of a single grey afternoon, and Rosamond stood in the great hall of Wexcombe Park accused of robbing the dead. This was the 3rd time the dowager named her aloud as less than she was, and it was no longer a private aside nor a forecourt warning. It was a witnessed report delivered before the assembled household in the cold light of the hall. The dowager standing at the foot of the great stair with the forged letter in one hand and the silver case in the other, naming the woman a thief and an impostor and a viper taken into the house's bosom, and calling on the Marquess to send her to the assizes, where conviction for theft from a noble house could carry a sentence past which there was no road home. The Marquess came down the stair into that. She did not look at him. She had her eyes on the middle distance and her face on the old stillness, the stillness that had kept her alive through every country she had crossed, and she was readying herself, with a calm that came from very far down, to lose everything for the 2nd time in her life, and to lose it with her chin level. She would not weep. She would not plead. She had learned, at 9 years old, beneath a canopy of gold thread and incense smoke, that there were losses past, which weeping was only one more thing the world could take from you, and she would not give the dowager that. She stood in the hall and waited for the Marquess to believe the letter, because every man she had ever known would have believed the letter, and she had no proof of her own innocence, because the only proof that had ever existed was ash in the dower house grate. What turned in that hall turned on no stroke of luck, and the reason it did not bear showing. The Marquess did not believe the letter. He took it from the dowager's hand and he read it, and his face did not change, and then he asked one question, in his level voice, into the silence of the hall. He asked the dowager to tell him the name of the county, and the master the letter came from, so that he might write at once to confirm so grave a charge before he acted on it. And the dowager named a county and a master, and the Marquess nodded slowly, and then he said the thing that broke the whole edifice of the lie, open in front of the household, because he had been doing all those quiet weeks, the very thing the dowager had never credited him with the patience to do. He had been listening. He said that he had spent the autumn in that study with this woman, and that in the course of it he had asked her, idly, the small things a man asks, and that among them she had once told him, mending a book, the towns she had passed through coming south, and at the county the letter named lay 100 miles off her road, and she had never in her life set foot in it, and that a former master in a county she had never entered was a former master who had never existed. He said it was a strange thing for a loyal inquiry to turn up a master from the one county the accused had demonstrably never been near. He said it without heat. He let it lie in the silence, and the household, who could do arithmetic, did it. Then he turned the silver case in his fingers, the late Marchioness's chased silver case, and he said the second thing. He said that the case had been kept since his wife's death, locked in a cabinet in his own dressing room, to which only he and Mrs. Mitry. Argent held the key, that he had taken it up not a fortnight past and knew the day exactly, because he had marked it, and for it to lie in the bedding of a woman who had never once been admitted above the library floor, it must have passed through the hands of someone who could open his locked cabinet and walk the upper house at will. He looked, when he said it, at the dowager's man, who had grown very still by the door. He did not accuse, he observed. He had built, brick by quiet brick across the whole length of that autumn, the foundation that let him stand in that hall and take a lie apart with two plain facts, and the demonstration of the woman's worth that saved her was a demonstration he had been gathering since the first dawn she named a binder's fault across a dark room. None of it was chance. All of it was attention, the rarest thing in that house and the thing the dowager, for all her cleverness, had never once paid the laundress. The dowager did not fragment all at once. She was made of sterner stuff than that. She drew herself up and said that a clever creature could account for anything, that the Marquess was bewitched, that he was throwing his name and his dead wife's honor after a hiring card adventuress, and her voice, for the first time in 40 years, climbed half a register past the gracious, and it was then, into that climbing voice, that the rider came. For the true packet had been taken and burned. That was so. The trusted man in town, being a careful man, had done what careful men do, and had sent his account north not once but twice, by 2 riders on 2 days, the copy a day behind the original against exactly the accident that had befallen the first. The second rider had reached the great house an hour past and had been kept waiting in the cold by a servant who did not know what he carried. And he came into the hall now with the sealed copy in his hand, and the seal was the seal of the Marquess's own man, and the Marquess broke it where he stood. He read it in the silence of the hall. It was a long letter. The household watched his still face take in, line by line, the road back through the forged name, and the borrowed boots to the burned cathedral register, and the murdered prince and the price that still stood in a foreign land on the head of his last living daughter. And when he had read it to the end, he looked up, and for the first and only time in 4 years the ice over the river broke, and the household saw their grave, silent master look at the accused laundress with his whole heart open in his face. And he crossed the hall to where she stood, and he stopped before her, and he did not take her hand, because he would not take it without leave, and he said her name, not Rosamund Hale. The other name, the one written in a register that had burned, the name she had not let herself hear spoken aloud in 3 years, and he said it gently and correctly, the whole of it, the name of a prince's daughter, and the saying of it in his level voice was the first time since the cathedral that anyone living had called her by it. And the stillness she had carried across 3 borders came apart in her at last, not into weeping, into something quieter and harder to bear, a kind of homecoming in the middle of a hall full of people who had just watched her, accused of robbing the dead. The household stood between 2 truths and chose, as people will when the truth is finally let into the room and they are no longer permitted to look away from it, correctly. Bess wept openly. Mrs. Argent had already begun to weep. The steward put himself, without being told, between Rosamund and the door, in case the dowager's man should think to leave. And the Marquess turned from her to the dowager. And here he did the measured thing, the thing a lesser man would not have had the discipline to do, choosing correction where another would have chosen ruin. He did not destroy her. He did not call the assizes down on the woman who had tried to call them down on Rosamund. He looked at his late wife's mother, the woman who had guarded her dead daughter's place for 4 hard years, and had bent the truth past breaking to do it, and he said, in 12 plain words pitched to carry the length of the hall, in the very place where she had rendered her verdict an hour before, that the lady he intended to marry would not be tried in his house. That was all. He claimed her. He named the marriage. He did it in the arena where the dowager had named her a thief, and he did it without raising his voice, and without a single word more than the claiming required, and the minimum was sufficient, and the household understood that the order of the house had changed forever in the space of 1 short sentence. The dowager understood it too. She fragmented then, but quietly, which was worse to watch than any rage. The forged letter slid from her fingers to the floor. She said her daughter's name, once the only true thing she had said in the hall, and the Marquess heard it, and the hardness went out of his face when he heard it, because he understood for the first time that the woman had not been defending her station only. She had been defending the last place in the world her child had stood, and that grief had made her cruel the way grief makes people cruel, and he was a man who knew exactly what grief could make of a person. He crossed to her. He did not embrace her, that would have been a lie between them, but he took her hand, the hand that had held the forgery, and he told her, lo, that her daughter's place in the house would be honored as long as he lived, that the Marchioness's portrait would not come down nor her name be unspoken, and that there was room in a house for the dead to be honored and the living to be chosen, both. And the dowager wept, finally, not for the loss of her order, but for her daughter, 4 years late. And it was Rosamond who crossed the hall to her, the woman she had tried to send to the assizes, and put a cracked hand on the older woman's shoulder, and that was the humbling, not a destruction, a recognition. The dowager corrected and displaced, and shown her error by the very grace of the creature she had misjudged. The dowager's man did not wait to be put between the steward and the door for long. He was gone within the week, and the matter of the burned packet and the river road went with him. And the Marquess who could have hunted it, let it go, because the woman it had been meant to harm was safe, and a hunted thing himself once does not lightly make another. There remained the price across the water, the standing price on the head of a prince's daughter, and the Marquess did not pretend it was nothing. He was not a man who pretended. A Marchioness of England, however, married before witnesses and entered in an English register that would not burn, settled on English land under English law, was a far harder thing to reach than a friendless laundress crossing borders under a false name. And they both knew it, and the knowing was not a triumph but a kind of grave relief. The door of the trap easing shut. Behind her at last she would never go home. The home was gone, the cathedral sacked, the great embroidered canopy burned with the register. She had been seen, though, fully, and at her true measure by a man whose seeing reordered the world she stood in, and that was the only restoration left to her in this life. And she found, to her own slow surprise, that it was enough. They were married in the small grey church at Wexcombe in the last week of November, with the household for witnesses and the dowager in the front pew in her dead daughter's pearls, given by her own hand to the new Marchioness that morning, without a word, which was the dowager's whole apology, and was accepted as such. There was no canopy of cloth of gold. There was a plain English church, cold stone, and a few late roses, and a man in a navy coat who had stopped pretending his face was ice, and a woman in a cream gown that fit her at last, who had stopped pretending her name was Hale. If the long, quiet braveries of women who are made to disappear and refuse to are the sort of thing that moves you, stay to the end of this one, because the end is the part the world so rarely shows. The winter closed in over Wexcombe Park. The great rooms, shut for 4 years, were opened and aired and warmed, and the house that had held its breath since a young Marchioness died of a low fever began, slowly, to breathe again. Rosamond did not become a different woman with the title. She kept the roughened, work-worn hands a while, until the labor that had marked them was 4 months behind her, and she kept always the habit of stillness that had been her armor on the long road south. And the Marquess loved it in her, the stillness, the way a man loves the strength in a thing that has had to be strong. She mended the books in the small study still, because she liked the work, and the leather smell and the firelight, and he sat with his ledgers at the far table still, and the silence between them was no longer made of the things they could not say. The dowager came up to the house at Christmas, and she came as a guest and not a ruler. And she sat by the fire with the new Marchioness, and told her haltingly the small things about the dead daughter that no one else living remembered, the way she had laughed, the song she had liked. And Rosamond listened the way she had once listened at the long deal table to learn the shape of a house, and the older woman, who had tried to break her, found in her at last the only person in the county willing to keep her daughter alive in the telling. They were not friends in the easy way. They were something graver and better suited to them both. Two women who had each lost the whole of a world and gone on living sitting by one fire in the dark of the year. On the last evening of that first winter, when the snow had come down soft over the park and the lamps were lit early, the Marquess found his wife in the small study with the book closed in her lap, not mending it, only holding it, her face turned to the window where the snow fell past the glass into the dark. He came and stood by her and did not speak, in the old way, leaving the silence open for her to fill or not, as she pleased. And after a while, she told him for the first time and the last, the whole of it. The cathedral and the canopy and the men on the stair and the long road south and the dead boy's boots. All of it, in the plain, flat English she had built her safety on. And he listened to every word without once looking away from her face. And when she had finished, he did the thing he had not done in the hall, because now he had leave. He took her hand. He turned it over in his, the hand the work had cracked and the winter had healed, and he held it the way he had once held a French book out of true, gently finding the place where it had been hurt. And he did not say that he would keep her safe, because they both knew the old price still stood beyond the sea, and that no man can promise that. He said instead that she was home. Only that. And the woman who had been bought for 12 coins at a hiring fair, who had been carried into a cathedral under cloth of gold and out of a sacked principality in a dead boy's boots, who had crossed half of Europe to keep her own throat from the knife, and 3 years of grey English rain to keep her own name from the world, set down the book she was holding and let herself at last be home. The snow fell on past the window into the dark, soft and steady over the grey stone and the bare autumn trees and the small church where they had married, and somewhere across the water a price still stood on a name no register held any longer. And inside the warm-lit study a man and a woman sat hand in hand by the fire. And the book she had been mending lay open on the table between them, its 2 crooked gatherings set right at last, every page in its proper place. Thank you for staying to the end of her story. If one quiet moment of it stayed with you, carry it gently, the way she carried her own true name across 3 borders, and let it remind you that the world's first verdict on a person is, so very rarely, its last.